We're starting the book of Kings. We have it in our Bibles as First Kings and Second Kings. Originally, that disparity wasn't there, so you can think about it as like the book of Kings, one continuous literary piece. This book actually has some good memories for me growing up. I went to a middle school camp when I was in middle school, so that was good. And I kind of had this like come to Jesus moment, and I asked my counselor, and I said, "Hey, what do I need to do to really grow in my walk with God?" And he said, "You need to read your Bible, you need to pray, and you need to have accountability, like a mentor or a friend or something." So I like took that to heart, and it was around seventh or eighth grade. I would probably say eighth grade. I made this commitment to read a chapter of the Bible every night. And all I would do is I'd read a chapter, I'd write on my little notebook, I'd write like half a page of just observations and thoughts. And then I'd write a half page of a prayer in relationship to some of those things that I learned. And I did that pretty consistently like through high school. So there was a good maybe 4 years of my life where I was pretty much reading a chapter a day. And to this day, there's still things that I have learned on my own in ninth, 10th grade doing that I draw on. And like, even after having education, being a pastor for a while, I still like look back on those. But anyways, I remember being in First Kings, and you start to read about all these kings, like once the kingdom is divided and who they were and how long they reigned and if they were good or bad. And I'm kind of like OCD. So I remember like drawing out little charts and like tracking the timeline and just kind of nerding out as a little person. So if you like doing that kind of stuff, maybe you like First Kings, but it was kind of sentimental to me to kind of jump back into this book and read. So let's jump into kind of the framework of the book of Kings. We're going to save the historical context to the end. And hopefully once we kind of encounter the book, at least the first part, we're going to swing back and try to talk about why this book was written, to whom, and to what the hope of reading this would be. So how are we doing here? Oh yeah. Is that big enough?
Yeah.
I tested it out on Thursday. I work here. So the structure of Kings, First and Second Kings, can be mapped out at a pretty simplistic way. In the beginning, we kind of see the end of David. He dies. We'll talk about it, but Solomon takes over, and you see Solomon kind of come to power in maybe a less than ideal ways. He asks for wisdom. He gains wealth and power. He constructs the temple that David wanted to build but wasn't able to. And then you kind of have this downfall that you can see coming that we're going to talk about. Lots of wives, lots of wisdom, but it doesn't end up super well for him. And that's the end of Saul, David, Solomon, one king over Israel, and from here on, it's split, the divided kingdom. We'll talk about it, but Solomon's son takes over the south to preserve God's promises to David that there would be a king in Jerusalem. The north is taken over, and we hear about that, and we start to see all these different kings, and to the extent to which they're faithful or not to what they ought to be as kings. For the most part, it's like you just assume they're not going to be that great. The good guys are few and far between in there. We meet two of the most prominent prophets in the Old Testament, Elijah and Elisha. Elisha actually asks for double the power of Elijah, and you can kind of see Elijah does about 7 major miracles, and Elisha does about 14. It's kind of cool. Basically, they are keeping watch over God's promises and the covenant and the obedience of the kings and the obedience of Israel. And so as a prophet, they're not necessarily predicting the future, although every now and then that happens. The predominant role of the prophet is to be a mouthpiece of God, watch over the covenant, and to call out the wickedness and evil that they're seeing in these kings, which they do repeatedly, often in dramatic ways. But it's interesting to follow their lives, which we're not going to get to Elijah and Elisha today. Sean will probably talk about that next week. Then you track the downfall of the northern kingdom. So the northernmost 10 tribes is mostly called Israel. They have about 20 kings, and they're all bad. It's like 0 for 20. Everyone strikes out. Eventually, they are overtaken by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC. And then you close out Kings looking at the downfall, or maybe not, of Judah, which has a few good kings. And there's one of the major themes of the book is this tension of how will God keep his promises to Abraham and keep his promises to David? And the Davidic covenant is found in... No. 2 Samuel 7. 2 Samuel 7. I was here like last week and y'all knew it, so...
Yeah.
Nerves will get you. All right, and then it comes to a conclusion, and then we're kind of left hanging. Like, well, what's going to happen to this dynasty of David? How will God fulfill his promises to have a king if these people are in exile? How is God going to intend to bless the world through this people if they can't even get their crap in gear? And then we're just kind of left hanging. And is there going to be this promised Messiah that we see? So that's kind of the overview of the book. Let's jump in to the beginning. So if you have your Bibles, go to 1 Kings 1. So the first thing we're going to encounter is this transition of leadership from David to his son Solomon. You start out with David in his old age. He's not doing super well. He needs someone to come keep him warm and care for him. It looks like it might get a little sketchy, but in chapter 4, we're told that they did not know each other in any sexual way. Yet still kind of this young, beautiful woman was still kind of in the role of like a concubine or like a servant. And so that comes into play later on, and we'll talk about why. And so we meet this guy, Adonijah. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but that's how I say it, Adonijah. And he is the fourth of David's sons. He's the oldest surviving son. So typically, you generally assume, all right, the king dies, the oldest son is going to take over. But if you've been reading the narrative long enough, you kind of like, well, that doesn't always seem to happen. Sometimes God picks the younger son, which seems to happen quite a bit. And so basically the question you're wondering as you begin to reading is who's going to take over? Who's going to take over for David as king? So David's oldest son, Ammon, is dead. His second son, Chileab, you can kind of presume that he is dead. Absalom is dead. And so you see Adonijah, the fourthborn, he's kind of impatient to take over the throne. He's got a couple guys on his side. He's got Joab, who is the military commander, and Abiathar, the high priest. And you start to see like tension. All right, who's going to side with Adonijah and who isn't? And there's a list of who doesn't. I think the fact that he doesn't have David's mighty men on his side is kind of a loss. But to each his own. He's set up with Absalom imagery, acquiring chariots and horses and men. So you kind of read a little Absalom vibes into it. But so the general public, he kind of makes this public display that he's going to be king. He sets himself up. He's handsome. He's born next after Absalom. He makes the sacrifice. But there's particular people that he didn't invite: Nathan, Benaiah, and the mighty men. All right. And so, hold on, where do I want to go next? All right. Yeah, so sorry. My bad. So Nathan the prophet, and this is who called out David with Bathsheba, goes to Bathsheba, is like, hey, I want you to know what's going on. Solomon is supposed to be king. And so then, hold on, guys. I'm lost in my notes here. All right. So anyways, basically Solomon is becoming king, and then there's this weird thing that happens where Adonijah asks Bathsheba to have the hand of that original kind of concubine that lays with David, Abishag the Shunammite. He asks for her as his wife. And so it looks kind of innocent. It's like, hey, your ploy to become king didn't really land well. But why don't you just like get this woman that you really want and we'll kind of like call it good. But what's interesting is that it's actually a little bit of a power play, because if he were to take as his wife one of David's concubines or wives, it's setting yourself up as if you're king, which if you hold on, I jumped way ahead. Anyways, so if you're in chapter 2, so chapter 2, verse starting in 13, he comes to Bathsheba and he's like, all right, hey, let's talk. He wants Bathsheba to go to Solomon and ask for this concubine as his wife. But then Solomon replies when Bathsheba asks in verse 22, chapter 2, 22. King Solomon answered his mother, why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my older brother, and on his side are Abiathar and Joab. And so what you see here is that Adonijah, as the oldest son, he's impatient for power. He wants to step into that role. Doesn't play out that way for him, but then he's still trying to take the throne afterwards. So jumping back to Solomon, he's younger than Adonijah, but he's the one that's chosen by God, and he's anointed as king. And there's this really cool moment where David gives instruction to Solomon, starting in chapter 2. And it seems to be really good advice. So this is chapter 2, verse 1. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me. If your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness, with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. And you're like, all right, this sounds great. Solomon gets wisdom from David. He's set up for success. If you're paying attention, there's a lot of Deuteronomic language in First Kings. In Kings, it's almost as if the author is saying, like, all right, how is the language and promises of Deuteronomy continuing on despite what we know to be true? And we'll talk at the end, but this is written at a later date. And so it's people looking back and saying, how did we get here? How are we supposed to interpret our history? And to say, like, well, here's kind of the setup of Deuteronomy. Here's how it played out for better or worse. And here's why we are where we are. So this language of keep charge of the Lord your God comes out of Deuteronomy 11:1. Walking in his ways comes out of Deuteronomy 8:6. So then we start with the reign of Solomon. And what's interesting is that he kind of starts out with some bloodshed. So he makes some killings. Does anyone know the people that Solomon kills off the bat. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. He kind of like takes away the priesthood. Yeah, and he has his new military commander do all this. And so what he starts to do is he starts to like take out people that kind of pose a threat to his empire. David kind of mentions this as something he might want to do, as David didn't quite deal with all of his baggage. And backing up to that Adonijah story, you have this picture of David on his deathbed, like maybe not full of his physical capacity. And there's this picture of the son coming to his mother to help her deceive his father for power. And it takes you back to what story? Yeah, Jacob and Esau. And so if you pay attention through Genesis, one of the themes that you'll find, other than just blatant family dysfunction, is the passivity of the fathers. That like the brothers are fighting. There's not clarity on who's doing what, and then you get this picture of like kind of this like really passive father that isn't like taking charge and helping to decide what goes down. So it's kind of like an interesting thing that you would think about as you're going through. And so before we jump into all of Solomon, so he kind of like wipes some people out. He asks for wisdom, but there's a lot of dual-sided nature to Solomon. For the most part, as you're reading, you're going to be thinking that there's a lot of highlights to Solomon of all the good stuff he does and the good stuff that he is. But at the same time, if you're paying attention, you'll see a breadcrumb trail of things where he's missing the mark. So much so that when you come to his downfall in chapter 11, that you shouldn't be surprised if you've been paying attention. And so I have a little assignment for you, and we'll talk these through. But I want to bring up 4 categories. And if you've done your reading, and you can skim through your Bibles, but I want you to turn to your neighbor and talk about how you see David's divided heart in these 4 categories. In what ways is his heart not wholly devoted to God as it relates to his knowledge and his wisdom, as it relates to his wealth, as it relates to his power as the king, and as it relates to his worship? So take a couple minutes, skim through chapters 3 through 11, and think through these categories about where do you see Solomon hit the mark and where do you see Solomon miss the mark in these categories. Go. First, chapters 3 through 11 of 1 Kings.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he has a chance to not letting God be in charge. Right.
He knows what he's done. It's pretty impressive in terms of his knowledge base.
Right.
So, how do you
Allows and sets up idols in Egypt for those
So is this an example of power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely? Talk about very beginning.
he's doing it because it's just easier for him to let the wives do it that way. Worship power.
Plus alliances.
Yes, alliances, yeah.
You know, rather than relying on law.
Right. Right.
So he was a polygamist.
Yeah.
Primarily for the, why was he a polygamist? Was it out of power?
I believe it was out of power.
Yeah,
And well,
absolute power,
And because
absolute
he
right.
could.
and because he was king, yes, right. Yeah, it was not about worship, I would say maybe a little bit about knowledge, because it allowed him to cut their alliances for the purposes of that.
All, virtually all cults come to an end. The cult leader is in the border.
Right.
What aspects of wealth?
No.
Well, you have so much money, so that it's worthless to kingdom, but bragged about to be allowed to, whoever to come in and steal them.
Right.
You know, rather than,
He wasn't using it for the betterment of the people, he was using it to accumulate. Yeah,
It kind of comes down to the absolute power.
Right.
Absolutely.
right.
Just hammer away at that because it's a corrupted.
Yeah.
And wealth is part of power.
Right, totally.
It's awful.
Yeah.
It's not the result of power, but it's the expression.
Yeah. Well, but I think it's a result of power as well. But keeping it and not distributing it, not using it is the control, is the wealth of the power as well.
Right.
Right, he wasn't using it for the betterment of his people. Yeah.
no money specifically had charities. Of course, they had been prohibited from.
Right.
Because God wanted them to rely on power.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's kind of a thing where back to the ways of the world.
Yeah.
Whereas like wealth, you could ask for
So he starts with
Yeah.
power.
He was he was pretty intelligent, pretty smart. But it didn't help him. It was, kept him out of what you don't see is coming ahead.
Yeah, so it went to his head. Well, I guess it's 10 and 11. And then talks about his families. Started to go to his head.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing that.
Idolatry.
Yeah.
He also referred back earlier to that building.
Doesn't seem that Yahweh.
It has the layout.
That's how we feel. Forced laborers.
Actually,
He had one in Century.
here's this house.
We haven't talked much about worship.
Yeah.
You good, Royce? Do you guys need more time? All right. No response. All right. I know that was a lot of chapters to cover and some pretty broad categories, but I think it's a helpful way to think if you're paying attention when you're reading. So one of the first things we see with Solomon, and that I think is maybe one of the more famous Solomon stories, is his request for wisdom that God grants, but then also grants him a bunch of wealth and stuff that is interesting. Of like, he could have asked for that, but he didn't, but he got it anyways. So that was always like what I did with God. I was like, I asked for wisdom, but then hoped he would give me something cool too. It's just a good hermeneutic. So now you know how to pray. That's a joke. So, but then he has that famous story with like the two women that claim the child is theirs. He wants to cut it in half. It just feels so intense. Um, by the way, I shouldn't even tell you this. I've always just been a little bit dumbfounded by that story. Of like, it feels like so obvious. Like you think the other woman would at least play it up. Like, no, don't cut the baby in half. But anyways, she lost. So, anyways, with wisdom and knowledge, how do you see Solomon having a divided heart with those things? Maybe I should have said wisdom instead of knowledge. So you can think in that category as well. What are some positive displays of his wisdom other than the baby story? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this guy's networked. Yeah, I would go to his leadership conference. Like, how do I lead a nation and build a temple with foreign people providing me lots of cool wood and gold? Solomon 101, right? Yeah, so there's kind of this knowledge practically about leadership. Yeah. Daniel, did you have your hand raised? Yeah. So it's not really in the text that we're reading, but we can, knowing the whole Bible, that the author of lots of wisdom literature. Anything else? Yeah, Mike. Right. Yeah, you see the wisdom not just as it relates to spiritual things, but also just knowledge of animals and other things that are just seem very like common and ordinary, and we're not necessarily told how that worked. Did he just like wake up one day and like knew all the names of the birds? Did he study? And that is kind of a question that we face today. Like how do I grow? What does God do? What do? I don't know. We're not given the answer, I think, in this text. Yeah, but where's maybe the underbelly of his wisdom or knowledge? Where does he fail, John?
You could interpret the lay that on thick and praising him, giving gold. Gave her everything.
Yeah.
So I kind of
So
think he was too wise.
okay, yeah, right. Or maybe he's a little cocky, a little arrogant. Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting is you start to read the book of Proverbs, and the theme when you get about wisdom is less to do with like acquiring lots of factual knowledge, but about the condition of your heart. It's like that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And what's interesting is that although Solomon is wise as a leader, and in many ways he makes really good statements to the people once the temple is built, we see a prayer that's pretty profound, and so he clearly has this fear of the Lord in him. But then there's also these situations where he clearly does not seem to fear the Lord as we get down to these other pieces. And so I think if you just look at factual knowledge, he knew a lot of facts. Then maybe there wasn't a ton of an underside to that. But if you look at that wisdom as actually fearing the Lord and more of a heart posture, a volition, not just head knowledge, then you start to see that there's little streams that became rivers, that became oceans in his life, that ultimately led to his downfall. Okay, so wealth. What's like the highs and lows of his wealth? Yeah. He wasn't supposed to have chariots and horses? Ooh, where was he told not to? Sally, 10 points. Extra credit on your next test. Tell Sean I promise that. Yeah, okay. So there was an underside. Like, it's cool to have chariots and horses, but he wasn't supposed to have them. Why?
He wasn't.
Accumulate, yeah, that's a command. Where did he get the chariots and horses? Egypt. He's supposed to have like a snuggly relationship with Egypt? No, yeah. Yeah, trust in chariots and riches. Mike, were you going to say something, or was
Yeah.
the Egypt?
Sean mentioned have this- go back to-
Yep.
He had like 700
Yeah, yeah. We'll get there. Yeah, so it's Deuteronomy 17, if you want to turn there. Verse 16 and a couple after that. This is why, by the way, if you're reading through the Bible repeatedly and meditatively, you're going to start to like you'd be reading through Kings and you would like hear Deuteronomy in your head as you're reading it, you know. So 17, 16, only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. He shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So Solomon did all those things pretty well. Big win. Yeah, there's also this interesting thing that happens with Hiram, the king of Tyre, in chapter 9. So Hiram is his, if I remember correctly, his source of like timber, so cedar and cypress, which is like, man, Solomon's going for it. We could talk about, you know, how much did this inform church architecture today? I don't know. We'll leave it to you guys. But so basically, it seems like Hiram is just like doing everything, Hiram probably, doing everything he can to like support Solomon with this nice timber. But then in chapter 9, it says, it'll say Solomon's other acts in verse 10. So the deal is that Hiram's going to give him a bunch of wood. Solomon's going to give him some cities. But in verse 12, when Hiram came from Tyre to see the cities that Solomon had given him, they did not please him. Therefore he said, what kind of cities are these that you have given me, my brother? So they are called the land of Kabul to this day. Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold. And so basically it seems like Solomon is a little bit stingy with his generosity to Hiram, that Solomon has as the leader of God's people, has abundant wealth. Other people from other countries are being generous to him, although Hiram is traced back to Israel. And then when it's Solomon's turn to thank the people from within or without that have been generous to his operation, he seems to be a little stingy, right? Which is interesting. And then the obvious underbelly. I mean, so we have this period of peace and prosperity, which is something that we're looking forward to in the nation of Israel. That silver is kind of like a non-valuable commodity, right? Could you imagine? And so like the standard of wealth is so high, so abundant. I mean, the numbers are like, they can't even count some of the things that they have. It's in such abundance. Exotic animals and visitors. I mean, he's getting like peacocks and stuff. I mean, I would want one if I could. I forget. Oh, peacocks. Yeah. Or baboons. Yeah, you're like, it's either a peacock or a baboon. We're not sure, but just bring it, you know, like we don't even know. So there's this perspective of Israel flourishing, that it has relationships with its neighbors, the people have food, the kingdom is beautiful and wealthy, and this is like, okay, we're moving in a good direction, except it starts to become so excessive and so abundant, and it seems like Solomon starts to get a little greedy, a little ungenerous, and often that's the next one, is how he was able to build the temple is an interesting thing. So let's go to power. How do you see the highs and lows of Solomon's power? Well, yeah, but that is where you learn something. Where what are you thinking, John?
really hard. So
Yeah. Yes. So that was Rehoboam, his son. Wait, hold on. They always get confused in my mind. Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Yeah, Rehoboam is his son. J comes before R. I'll remember that now. I actually taught that to the 4th and 5th graders a couple weeks ago in kids' church. So it was a fun, listen to old people, kids. More of the story. But yeah, so if that's actually in chapter 12. But if you read there, chapter 12, verse 4, these are the people talking to Jeroboam, saying, here's how we want you to lead us. He says, your father, who's Solomon, made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. And so that's actually the inquiry of the people. So, yeah, there's forced labor, and it's not always clear how if that came from within Israel or outside. I think 9:15. This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the house. And he starts to list. I'm not an expert on this piece, but I do think it's not always clear, did this forced labor come from within or without? But either way, Solomon built this really cool, awesome temple, but it was a lot of work to get there. People became a commodity to an end. And so, yeah, John, great observation, an underside of power. Anything else stands out to you? Yeah, first move. Yeah, you wonder what do you think being the king of Israel means? And how are you going to go about that? I'm going to kill the people that are threats. I'm going to marry the daughter of the neighbor that has a lot of power. Yeah. So, yeah, is it an either or? He either did or he didn't? Yeah, he's divided. He seems to live on both sides of the fence. And as far as I can tell, seems comfortable to do it. Which is interesting insight, I think, into the human condition. And I feel like we're all not that far away from that, right? Like, the more we try to stay faithful to Jesus, the more we see the little pieces of our heart that still are holding on and are divided. And it's not always so black and white to parse it out of where are we going right and where are we going wrong. He did do that. Yeah, she was living large. Yeah, so I'm not sure how that works. He certainly was. It certainly wasn't his only wife. So, but I don't think they all got houses. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe that just seems like how it happened. I don't know the historical context. Yeah, Mike.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Right? God knew Jesus. And sitting on the throne next to him.
Mm-hmm.
But God's hand in the
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting story to read, for sure. And so we part of the power is that Solomon is in 328. Solomon's given wisdom to do justice, and part of the whole purpose of Israel is to be a blessing to the world. Like, they're supposed to be an abundant picture of God's true life that extends out to the foreigner, and blesses those around them. And yet you see Solomon not particularly ruling with justice, which if you follow your way through the kings and the story of Israel, through the prophets, much of the errors are the way that they're not caring for the foreigner or the migrant, the way that there's injustice in the leadership of the nation of Israel that's called out. And so when Solomon's given power, he doesn't always exert that power in a way of justice to those who don't have the power. So last one, you guys are doing really well. This is taking a while. Worship. Like, how do you see the positives and negatives of Solomon's worship? Yeah. God comes and dwells in this like cedar, cypress, gold laden, giant, magnificent, high place that is the temple. Like, holy cow. So cool. Sally. Yeah. Yeah, and so then what happens? Is it like, oh, you go worship and come back, or interesting? Yeah, that is the big one. That he starts to build these other high places. There's multiple high places to different gods. I do think it's interesting. I mean, there's explicit warnings about him not marrying foreign wives, that they will turn his heart away, but he clung to his wives. He was not wholly true to God. So this is kind of like my question is, I don't actually know the answer, but how would marrying these wives, and it's like, okay, I'm connected to Yahweh, you have these other gods, you're worshiping them. So why does Solomon then, like, what's the temptation for him to go worship these other gods? It's one thing if you want to have them as wives and let them go worship on their own, but how does being married to these people actually turn his heart away?
Alliances and coverings. I don't see him as being faithful, 100% faithful.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
We're all going to play. And
I'm gonna have a big house.
it's really
Yeah. Daniel.
7 years building a temple. Very next verse. 13 years building a temple.
Yeah.
So there's this like, wait a minute. That's where the priorities are.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd probably go there. Must be nice.
David had Nathan.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing where Solomon's head.
Hey.
Why are you marrying,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, we really turned on Solomon. Who is this guy? Daniel. He did. Yeah, he replaced him with. Yeah, where's that in my notes? It's somewhere in my notes. But yeah, well, Abiathar actually then shows up again later, so it's I don't think it's quite clear what all went down. But yeah, you see, I want you guys to turn to chapter 11, kind of at the end of all this, and let's look. Let's just look at some of the language that's used to describe this, and I want to just a couple kind of maybe pastoral comments. So, chapter 11, verse 1. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. We're also told that he loved the Lord and many foreign women. So we start to get insight into Solomon's heart, and we don't just mean emotions like the flutteries. There's an intellectual and a volitional sense to heart, especially in the Hebrew understanding of it. And so you see him loving God and loving many foreign women. And somehow both seem to be true. Maybe the first one can't be true if the second one is true. So he's along with a daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn your heart after other gods." So far we've talked that Solomon loved foreign women, and they have turned his heart after their gods. Then Solomon clung, it's an interesting word, clung to these in love. Clung to these in love. 700 wives, 300 concubines, and again, his wives turned his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods again. And his heart was not wholly true to Yahweh, his God, as was the heart of David, his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord. So is his heart wholly true? Is he wholly following the Lord? No, he loves these wives. He clings to them. In his old age, they turn his heart. They turn his desires. They turn his volition. They turn his affections away from Yahweh. Then, verse 7, then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all of his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. So it starts to look rough. It's like, man, we finally get this temple that we've wanted to be the centerpiece of Israelite worship, but it becomes not the only high place in the royal family, in Solomon's heart, and ultimately the hearts of the people. And the worship of these other gods leads to some really weird stuff down the line that you'll read as you keep going through Kings and Prophets through the Old Testament. So I want to look at verse 9. And Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. So, Solomon's had two of these direct, divine, supernatural encounters. We'll talk about the temple, but a dark cloud coming over it, God's glory, God's presence filling the temple. It's like something that in the second temple rebuild in Ezra and Nehemiah, they're like, man, we're waiting for that Solomon moment, but it didn't happen, and they're kind of disappointed. That's how big the Solomon moment was. And he had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. But He goes back to his Davidic covenant promise, 2 Samuel 7. For the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days. I will not, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant, for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So God's torn. He's made this promise of like, hey, if you're not going to be faithful, if you're not going to show covenant faithfulness, the kingdom's going to fall apart. He's also said, hey, I will have someone seated on this throne in Jerusalem that will one day save the world. And so what you see this tension of the book, the divided kingdoms, is like the 10 northern tribes. It starts to go downhill. They're exiled first. They're 0 for 20 in king leadership. It's just bad news bears the whole way, spinning down the toilet. Maybe not even fully like reestablished. And so then there's this interesting kind of like remnant piece of Jerusalem that there seems to be, like, you finish Kings and you're like, could there still be hope that the line of Judah could one day have a king and fulfill its intended and purpose as the nation of Israel, as humanity, that God would work through these people like we've been wanting to happen this whole time. But so what's interesting is that, first of all, Solomon's sin isn't just personal, it's public. That the effects of his sin isn't just between him and God. It affects nations. It affects people. Lives are lost. And so if you're reading through Deuteronomy, this is where we have the Shema. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. If you read through that first part of Deuteronomy and just track every time you see God talk about your heart and your loves, your affections, it's numerous. And what's interesting is that it's not for lack of knowledge that Solomon failed. Like, he didn't need another Bible study lesson on what he's supposed to do, right? He knew what he was supposed to do, and he knew what he wasn't supposed to do. And what's interesting is that he also didn't need one more divine encounter with God. He had two, and pretty like epic, like Sinai-like experiences. And he knew what was going on. And so Solomon's downfall wasn't a lack of Bible knowledge. It wasn't a lack of experience with God. What was it? Yeah. He's just with a womanizer. Yeah.
Where he wanted the easy way, not the hard way.
Yeah.
It's me just.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good observation. I haven't thought about that. Maybe you could consult the book of the Acts of Solomon, where the rest of his acts are written.
Yeah, but also he has, it's of no consequence to him what's going to happen to the rest of the line.
Yep. And you start to get adversaries. So I'm getting ahead of myself. But I want to stay here. This word practice, and like Sean gave this to me, as like, oh, you get to talk about people's loves and practices. I was like, okay. I think, yeah, sometimes if we're honest with ourselves, it's not that hard to relate to Solomon, right? Like, we get it. We get the tension and the difficulty of our affections that in one sense can be true to God and love God, yet also not be wholly devoted, and turn and love, whether it's women or power, like sex, power, fame, whatever the roots of our problems are. And now interesting is like on this moment of history where we find ourselves, we have questions of what does new birth in Christ look like? What does God's presence in his spirit living in us and renewing us as a new humanity look like? Or do you have a little bit of little extra like superpower to do that. Yeah, we still are come in contact with the human condition. But what's interesting is that, you know, David had his downfall. God's like, he was a man after my own heart. Solomon wasn't. But what you see here is this word practice. Therefore, the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, this has been your practice. What's a practice?
Choice.
It's a choice. It's repeated. Yeah. Yeah. It's been your attitude. It's been your posture. It's been how you've shown up repeatedly. For lack of a better illustration, I like motocross, dirt bikes and stuff. It's okay. I'll teach you about it someday. I will practice you into loving dirt bikes. But anyways, I mean, dirt bikes today have a lot of power. So one thing that happens is ruts form in a corner. And the track can start flat, but then you get 20 to 40 450cc motorcycles running for 40 minutes on the same corner. By the end of the race, there's so many ruts in the corner, and some of them are, 1 to 2 feet deep. You're dragging your knees and your foot pegs. And what happens is, once you get in that rut, it's really hard to get out of it. And the rut was formed through repetition, like the same force at the same place over and over and over again gets you deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And you wonder, it's like, well, when did Solomon fail? And it was like, yes, at the end, but he was slowly failing the whole time.
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
It was just everything he was doing was leading to the ruts.
Right. All of the little decisions every day about what he chose to do. I mean, think back, like maybe at the very beginning, he marries a couple wives, builds them high places. And he's like, I shouldn't be doing this. So he gets rid of the wives, takes the high places down, goes to the temple, repents. Maybe someone calls him out, tears his clothes. He's like, I gotta, like that whole rut could have been diverted. And I do think when we get to the question of how is it that then we as Christians learn to love God? Well, it's through practice. It's creating a different rut, not in the direction of loving other gods or loving other wives or loving other wealth or whatever, but it's how do we create ruts where we're then just channeled into practices that shape our affections, that shape our attitudes, that then help us fulfill the Shema in Deuteronomy to actually love God. Yeah.
So one of the big differences, David, having an order and offensive army, God held him ravaged for days,
Mm-hmm.
chased. Anyhow, he chose the 3 days, but so many people. The difference was David repented,
Yeah.
cried to the Lord when Solomon was like didn't repent. Like, okay, that's the way.
Yeah.
We don't know that, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jeff.
Well, when you have allegiances, philosophy, voice of Yahweh,
Yeah.
is hearing. Quite likely. Good news from something else or from
Yeah.
Maybe it's because I'm living in 2023, but the fact that God spoke to him twice, came to him, mind-boggling. God would actually talk to him.
Yeah.
Yet still, he made other choices.
700 talking. From a human standpoint, everybody that's in this room is married to one woman. How could you quit somebody?
Yeah, that's too hard. Can't pass it on.
I think we see elements of how it's called. Because his behavior, his knowledge, his wealth, his power, are really centered on corruption. And that corruption increases just like it does with cult leaders.
Daniel,
One
Or-
of the
Mike.
You know, as you begin to hear how worship saw things,
Yeah.
he tried in his own mind. God's
Yeah. Daniel.
Same people who saw the plague walk through the Red Sea. Things get a little bit difficult in the desert, and they go, "Oh, God's forsaken us." There's a theme of perseverance, right? Explicitly, it's Solomon's old.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy to be hero of the faith for a minute, right?
Yeah.
But like over time, you get distance between God taking you through the Red Sea. So remember what God did in the Exodus. Remember, you have to remember those things. Remember them.
Yep.
You don't teach your kids to remember them. By the end of your life, you don't care anymore.
Yep.
And so something I think repeatedly.
Yeah. Yeah, and it kind of makes you wonder, like, if God is slow to anger, how long can he wait? And how long does he wait? And even pastorally, I think a question that many of us might ask for ourselves or for someone else is like, how long until like there's just no hope for this person? Like, maybe even when God said this, like, could Solomon still have like torn his robe and repented, and like maybe would have there been grace for that? And I think maybe sometimes we think we're too far gone ourselves, or someone we know is too far gone. But I do think one of the postures you see of Yahweh is that he's patient, and there seems to be a lot of grace even in the Old Testament narrative, which is interesting. Have you guys ever watched or read the book Animal Farm? Kind of like classic little piece of literature. So it's political commentary, but basically there's these oppressive human farmers that are overseeing this farm of animals, and the animals start to not like it. I read this a long time ago, so if you guys are literary people, just correct me. But this is my understanding, so it'll work. What? Yeah. Okay, you just read it. All right, I'm counting on you. Call me out, and I will just. So anyways, what happens is all these animals don't like the human leaders. They're oppressive of their farm, but slowly the pigs start to get like a little bit of an in with the humans, and they're given a little bit of power, a little bit of oversight. They're given a little bit of privilege, and they slowly like work their way up to the very final scene of the book is all the animals looking into the house, and the pigs are eating with the humans, and you can't quite tell the difference of who's a pig and who's a human. Is that these people that were on the oppressive side of power have been given power, rose to eventually oppress someone else. And I just see that a little bit with Solomon and maybe Pharaoh. You get to the end and you're like, man, you've used forced labor to build a really cool thing. You've acquired wives and wealth and chariots and horses. You worship a plethora of gods. You're sitting on your throne. And these people that Yahweh has led in Exodus from Egypt, they're looking at their king and they're like, is that Solomon or is that Pharaoh? And it started with his heart turning slowly to God. So his sins are not private. His sins are very public. How'd I do? Oh my goodness. I'm telling your homeschool teacher. Do you know who that is? Well, now you know.
Now you gotta go read it.
That's the Spark Notes. All right, we're hanging out here, but we gotta move on. So I want to just talk a little bit about the temple. I had these cool things I was gonna do with you, but we got to move on. This is called a game. It's called True or False or something else. You ready? The Old Testament is a bunch of rules that prove we're sinful, and the New Testament is a bunch of good news that we can be forgiven. Grace. True or false or something else? That sounds mushy, Lorraine. What's the something else? What's the something else?
Thinking.
Okay. Well, you said it confidently, so.
That I would say that you can't take one without the other, and that's Jewish tradition is 5 books, and they don't have the new Messiah, they don't have going forward, so you can have one without the other.
Yeah. There's obviously good news to Jesus and the news that we find in the New Testament. But at the same time, I mean, look at God longing for affections and hearts. Look at him being patient, giving second chances, third chances, working with people. So anyway, maybe this is silly. Maybe you guys have been taking this class long enough. You can maybe see the true and the untrue of this. But yeah, Daniel. You're the only one that knows, so yeah.
I think the
Yeah.
problem with this is the issue of logic. True or false says it's black or white. So you read
Sure.
through that and you say, well, that's true, but it's not just that it's true. There's so much nuance to it. There's a lot of not just black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Not
It's something
just
more.
two options.
It's something more.
True.
Yeah. Yep. So, anyways,
Oh, wait, let's do the next one.
okay. This will lead us into our next conversation.
What does our illustrious leader tell us about that question that you just put up?
This last one.
Yeah.
You have to ask Sean when he gets back.
Oh, that illustrious leader. What about you?
Well, I mean, you can probably like tell like I'm on the road, and I'm not trying to like go too far down the thing. It was just my way of creating discussion around. I was reading through this week, and I was like, oh man, like I'm kind of taken back at God's like patience to his promises, his willingness to keep working with these people and keep showing patience. And I was like, man, it seems like there is a lot of grace still here, and the fact that well, we'll talk about this too, but God's laws aren't just like God's floating up in space and he made a bunch of rules and he wrote them down and there's a cajillion of them and don't break any. And if you break one, you're guilty. And they're like, dang it, we're guilty until Jesus. Now suddenly we're free. Like that the laws of God are based in his character, based in his intention for the world and intention for humanity and desire for what Israel is supposed to be a blessed and flourishing nation, to be a blessing to the nations around it. And so it's not just like, as parents, you have kids, you don't make up a bunch of rules just so your kids can have rules to follow. They're all intentional for like how you understand what they should become or how you want your family to function. And so I think sometimes we just oversimplify it and we rip the law out of context and just think that God just made a bunch of rules, so we're guilty, therefore we need Jesus. And it feels a lot more like layered and way more beautiful than that in my mind. So I'm not necessarily think this audience is particularly struggling with this, but I do feel like it's kind of a stereotype that the Old Testament can get of just these abstract laws that God just gave. So this is an interesting one. True or false, something else. The Bible is primarily a conversation about heaven and hell. So no. Tell me why. Jesus? Well, Jesus saves you from hell. Okay. Yeah. It's true. Yeah. Okay. It's a story about heaven and hell. Yeah, I mean, if you go back to Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And yeah, like understanding what our concept of heaven is versus the skies and the earth. But what you see in Eden, and like I'm sure that Sean has talked to you about Eden being a temple, right? Or the whole earth being God's temple. This is like you hang out with Sean for like 5 minutes and you get here. Eden was a temple. Well, it's interesting is that Solomon's temple has a lot of Eden imagery. And so these cherubim kind of guarding the sacred place, kind of showing that separation that you have, God's presence coming down. It's like a Sinai type language, like a dark cloud descends on Sinai, the dark cloud descends on the temple. God's presence is there. And so the temple is the place where heaven and earth meet. It's the place where God's glory dwells. And so it's the place where God meets with his people. And so what's interesting is that so much of the imagery, like you walk into this temple and you're seeing trees and pomegranates and things that would have been in Eden, and it's taking you back to the Garden of Eden. So the temple is the center of Israelite worship, where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence begins to rule and reign on earth as originally intended in the garden, and where the priests, like Adam and Eve, are meant to work and keep up this worship system that has lots of beauty, lots of symbolism, and lots of ritual. Why can I not say ritual? Holy ritual. You're gonna need to edit that out. Holy cow! I don't think I've ever had that happen to me. Anyways, I didn't sleep much. We're good. Yeah. And so there are Israelite worship is a series and sequence of repeated actions that remind Israel of what God's original purposes are for the earth and for humans, what their original role is as humans in Eden. And so the ethic and the liturgy of temple worship was driving you back to God's original plan and to his ongoing promises. So I just think that's interesting that the worship of Israel wasn't just like, hey, just keep it low key, be authentic, true to yourself, don't get caught up in symbolism, but it was very symbolic and it was very ritualistic. So anyways, just an interesting observation. So that the temple is the place where God lives and rules all of creation as king. There's a sense that all of creation is God's temple. The temple is filled with symbols of the garden. It's the place where God dwells with his people. And much of the downfall that we see in the garden is that humans want to work and rule on our own terms. And so I do think there is some interesting to see Solomon's downfall. It's like if you look at the Garden of Eden, you look at the Temple of Solomon, he created the best place for God's presence at this point to be with his people, to symbolize Eden. And there's still that barrier there. There's the Holy of Holies. You can go there once a year. It's guarded. There's the Ark of the Covenant back there. So it's not full Eden, but Solomon begins to make the same mistakes of Adam and Eve that caused their downfall. It's almost like you're reading the story and you're like, yes, look at this temple. We want this king. We want these people to not make the same mistake that Adam and Eve do. And you just start reading, you're like, all right, here we go again. And that's the story. That's the narrative that's repeated so far. And it will be until we see Jesus step into some of these roles as priest, as king, begin to fulfill what we really need, not just in our hearts, but in the cosmic rule of God in the whole world. So anyways, I want to just go flip to the end. So the kingdom's divided theologically. It's because God promised that it would happen if the kings weren't faithful. Politically, that Rehoboam was like, I'm going to increase the work. And so the allegiance goes to Jeroboam. And so you have this divided kingdom. But I want to get to just the end, the historical context. So Solomon's reigning and ruling from about 970 to 930 BC. We go through the prophets. But anyways, so we're not exactly sure when this book was written or when particular pieces of it was written. There's evidence in 2 Kings 25, 27 to 30 that describes the release of Jehoiakim from prison, which is 561 BC. Sean wanted me to talk about in 1 Kings 10, 15 that talks about the kings of the West, which means the perspective of the writer would be east. And I'm not an expert on all this, but basically we're looking at a date of like the exile period, so that the framework is that the people of Israel are exiled in Babylon or Judah, however you want to say it. They're exiled away, and you start to pass down generations, and kids of their parents that were exiled start to ask the question, like, why are we here? What are we doing here? I'm told we're God's people. I'm told we have these promises, these covenants that we're under. So why are we over here in Babylon? Why are we not where we used to be? And so you write this book of Kings to show how the line of David has a thread of hope to continue, despite the repeated failures of these kings, despite God's promises, the warnings of the prophets, and that it's justified that you are here in Babylon, because look at this storyline, like look at the decisions that these people made. And so if you're like a 30-year-old born in Babylon, you're reading through this book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, you would get to the end and you would be like, all right, I got it. Like, I know why we're here. I understand how we got here. But then you would be left with a thread of hope that God could still fulfill his promises through the line of Judah. So anyways, there you go. Yeah.
What is that whole, that picture behind you?
Yeah, the giant swimming pool, the hot tub.
Yeah, it's the cows are home.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's 12 cows, 3 in each directions. I forget the symbolism, but it's water that's used for washing. I think that it uses to fill those 10 little ones that has particular washing rituals. I'm not an expert in 12,000 gallons. We could all swim in that. Yeah, the very first people were baptized there, but yeah, I'm sure you could look that up. I don't want to pretend to know, but it's connected to washing. I think it's the holding tank for the other little bins that go around on wheels, So anyways, pretty cool stuff. My one thought was like, we brought in all this really cool wood and then we covered up all the wood with gold. I was like, we could have just used like Home Depot 2x4s, but when you got it, flaunt it. All right. I think it's time. Let me pray for us and then you guys can go.
We need
Do you normally?
for the time.
Yeah, I'd say if you want to help me clean up, I would invite it. So let me pray for us. God, we're grateful for your patience with us. So grateful for the good news that in Christ you are restoring your original creation. That includes the whole world and also us, down to those little decisions we make in our hearts. And we relate to Solomon, and in the room, like where we're at individually and maybe where we're at as a church, the places where we still see a divided heart. And it is so easy to just get tangled up to make that a practice and for our hearts to just turn. And if we find ourselves there, would you somehow show us your patience, show us your goodness, that we would, like David, repent rather than like Solomon, just kind of continue down the path. So thanks for these people that really want to learn the Bible. Would you bless them and just make it come alive and make them so excited about it? In your name, amen.